Good afternoon, everyone. Um, I'm excited that a lot of you guys came to join us today. I know it's sort of the tail end of CIS and this is sort of the last push. But for those of you that don't know me, so my name is Remy Lyle. I'm a regional solutions architect with Ping, which basically means that I get to solve our customers' problem, and I'm on the front lines along with the rest of my team. And I've been in the identity space for the last 12 years as a PS person, developer, POCer, architect, occasionally support engineer if support doesn't answer your tickets. So today we're going to talk about what we're seeing in the field as far as consent management and just some design patterns that we're seeing, but I'll expand on that. So just a little bit of intro. I think that very recently we're hearing a lot of buzz with consent management, especially around GDPR. What's interesting is that I think if you, especially for those of us that have been in the industry for a while in identity and access management, traditionally when somebody says IAM, we tend to think user provisioning, we tend to think role-based access, authorization, single sign-on, federation proofing. But not really so much around, controlling the data and, giving users control about what attributes they can see. But there's definitely a lot of, sort of buzz around it. There's a lot of blogs and vendors are writing about it, analysts are writing about it. We decided, though, that for this talk, to make things a little bit more interesting is, what is the field actually seeing? If any of you know Steve Schoaf, who's the Chief Product Officer at Ping, he loves the field. He looks to us a lot of times to help drive the direction of where, the strategy is going for our products. Because from a practical level, that's where things are actually happening, right? So I think that, there's a lot of, you can write about it. There's a lot of, sort of theoretical talk at the high level and, the open standards group and all that. But at the end of the day, the people that are out in the field, what is actually being deployed? What is practically, how are customers kind of seeing everything? So Pam thought it would be a good idea to kind of get the field perspective and, having spent, my entire career in the field, thought that we could kind of talk about it. So just so you guys know, the design patterns that we'll talk about is not just, my own experience, but it's actually a collection of the different interactions that, Ping customers have had, or that are, RSAs at Ping have had with our customers. So, what are, the approach we took is, if somebody were to design, a consent management system, completely vendor agnostic, what are some design patterns that you should be considering when you're, thinking about putting together consent management in the perspective of identity management? So, what are customers actually asking for? How are they actually defining consent? And that's what we'll talk to you guys about today. So, this is a fun first question. Well, what is consent? I think the thing that I found most interesting right off the bat is I asked this question to just 5 people, and I got 5 completely different answers. At the heart of it all, I mean, there's many different types of consent, right? So there's consent as far as, I'm jdoe at mydomain.com, and I consent to give my mail to appoint.me. I let them do, view my email calendar, sort of more granular attribute scopes basis as far as consent goes. And then you also have the more all-encompassing, terms of service. And it's funny because not a lot of people, even Pam, actually, when her and I were kind of going through this, even view sort of terms of service as a form of consent, but in many ways it is consent, right? The user is saying, hey, I agree to whatever this long verbiage that you have in front of me that says, I have to give you my firstborn and, give up my data and all that good stuff, right? So it's a different definition for everybody, and I think the thing that I find most interesting is that consent management itself is not something new, right? I mean, healthcare has been doing it for a really long time. I fill out a consent form. I write that, hey, I agree to participate in this research. But I think where it's really new for us is, kind of embedding that within the user profile and, including that within identity management and allowing users to not only update their first name or last name or address, but as part of that, also, have the ability to, granularly control their data. So it's getting there, it's maturing, but again, kind of it sort of varies right now for what how customers are defining it. So the first design pattern that we see is that it really is its own object type. Even for the implementations that we've done, we tend to wrap consent. If you look at how the user data is actually stored, it's actually part of the user object, but in many ways it really is its own independent object type. So it's very similar to roles in that within my user object, I can have a role, but within my user object I can have all the different consents that I have. But what's interesting is that similar to roles, it has its own metadata. Right? So, how did I, what is the description of this metadata? How did I use it? What's the version of this? And it really has its own life cycle, which I'll go over in the next slide. And there's a workflow component that's part of that because similar to roles, you have to have a CRUD layer on top of it. So how do you create consent? How do you update it? How do you manage it? And then how do you, remove it or revoke it? Typically, we see it stored as a JSON object. And the other thing that's really interesting to me about consent is that it can live beyond the identity. So if you think of consent, for example, between a husband and wife or legal relationships, right? Even though the identity might physically no longer be there, their consent lives on, right? And you still have to honor that in many ways. So there's legal relationships, there's real estate relationships. So to me, it's a really interesting identity-related object because, unlike roles that sort of die with the identity, consent is unique in the sense that it can really live beyond the identity, which is something that's pretty unique to it. From a life cycle perspective, pretty straightforward. This is how we envision or how we've been seeing consent, managed. So you have the creation of the consent, and then you have a management of that, and then you have either a user revoking that consent or perhaps the consent expires, right? Which are two different use cases, and then obviously you have an option to renew, and then you want to make sure that you're auditing and logging consent as part of that. One thing to consider is, it's funny because, again, this kind of goes back to the fact that, consent management within identity management is still maturing. But, when you say you do consent management, you have to consider things like, well, how often am I collecting this consent? So there's a timer on it that's in many ways similar to a password object, right? In the sense that, okay, if a user agrees, to this specific thing, how long is that valid for? And then, I have to have a timer on that from an implementation perspective because, at the end of 12 months or at the end of 6 months, I want to make sure that I either, ask them again to renew or, I collect their consent again, or maybe they just revoke it. Another interesting thing is specifically maybe more closely related to terms of service, are users agreeing to, the latest version of your consent? What if you have minor changes in wording? How do you handle that? And so with that, this is actually an example schema that we used for consent that we actually used out in the field. The only thing I would say I sort of modified for this presentation is I separated out the consent as its own actual object. But you'll notice that within, the consent object itself, we gave it a URN type identifier. I just gave it a little bit of a description. The consent manifestation is, if for example, if you look at what this consent is, it's to, a consent for a user to, hey, you can, send me newsletters via email. So perhaps for, a terms of service, you could say, well, this is, a terms of service and it manifests itself as a term of service that the user agreed to. Or if it's, for example, more on the OAuth, scope attribute level, then maybe the ID is the actual attribute that you're using, that you're having the user agree to share. But maybe it's an application that will actually receive that that specific attribute. Is this required, true or false? And I think, again, what's interesting about this is that, while this is, kind of loosely the schema that we've been seeing implemented for our own consent management implementations for customers, there's plenty of variations to this. And I was trying to find, okay, what's sort of common between all of them, right? And then from a user data perspective, we want to store, well, how did we collect this consent? What is the timestamp? When does this expire? Did they opt into this or did they opt out? So, again, this is the, schema that we followed, but there's definitely variations of this from customer to customer that we found in the field. The other interesting point is if you look at, for example, some of the open standards work that are out there, Cantera is putting together or has put together the consent receipt specification, and the idea behind that is, you get a receipt when you when you agree to something, kind of similar to how you would receive from a purchase or something like that. But again, it comes down to the fact that different businesses define consent differently. And again, there's the question of, is there enough commonality for a schema to be used? As I mentioned, this is in the field kind of has worked for us, but I think over time, I'm sure a lot of very smart people will come together and say, you know what, I think we should all be using the same, naming conventions and standards and all that and the format for this. But so far, nothing yet. So from the field, we sort of, at least for, from our team's perspective, this is what we've, managed to put together. The other thing that definitely customers are asking us for is consent transparency. They want to provide their users or their constituents with the ability to self-service manage the consents. I think right now it's pretty prevalent still that there's a lot of consents that are given during registration, but then there's really not an opportunity to modify that from a user perspective. And I think definitely with GDPR, there's a lot of shift in making sure that as part of the profile management UI, that consent is taken into consideration as part of that. It's important for a lot of our customers, and this is something that we see in all RFPs, is that, whatever solution we go with, that we provide users the ability to, revoke those consents at any time, because, obviously for our customers, it could potentially lead to fines and penalties, frustrated users, and threats to privacy. The interesting question here, though, is how granular you're allowing your users to change consents, because, and I actually have a graph of this later on, are we making consent so granular that it becomes, physically hard for users to manage that, right? Like, are we really expecting our users to log into their profile management and keep up with all the consents that they've given and, make sure that, oh, I really don't want this or that. So I think it's important to consider the UI that we're building. And yes, we want to give users control over their data, but at the same time, we don't want to make it overwhelming so that they tend not to, go to that portal at all, or, decide to sort of shy away from the power that we're giving them. From our perspective, this is an example of a UI that we put together. As you can see, it's pretty simple. Even though we're storing all that metadata in the back end, we're simplifying it from a front end, from a user perspective. We're just saying, hey, did you grant this to Delivery Co? These were the attributes that you provided. This is the description of that. So again, kind of UI has to be taken into consideration as far as transparency. From an opt-out perspective, this is another requirement that we're seeing out a lot in the field. We want to make sure that there is an enforcement of the opt-out, whether this is allowing users to revoke their consent or letting an expiration period expire. One thing that I found interesting about this pattern is that there's a lot of focus on this in the RFPs that we see. Everybody's so caught up in make sure that whatever system you're designing, you're honoring the opt-out. But it's interesting because, opt-in, I think, is just as important, right? And we'll talk about that in a minute. But from an opt-out perspective, like, who really enforces consent? In the implementations that we've done and in kind of the design that we've done, we add a governance layer on top of the data for consent, and then that, from an identity provider perspective, we provide the opportunity to enforce consent. But from an application side, the applications that are receiving the consent, we really don't have any guarantee that they are, that they're enforcing this consent. Our governance layer, utilizes, XACML so that we can apply that fine-grained access control. And what's interesting is that I actually had this idea of consent governance, right? So if you look at traditional identity and access management today, we have the idea of access governance. But, the whole theory behind that is that, you have systems that go back and check to see, well, is this person really supposed to have this access? You've granted it. Now we're sort of doing an audit to make sure that you granted, the right access. But what about consent? And how do you address, conflicts that arise from that? So again, that's something to consider when designing your consent management system. So this is an implementation example, a design example. So if you notice here, we have a policy that we wrote. We said, if the client ID is, marketing engine and the user isn't opting in, we want to make sure that we exclude email. So if we look at the actual response, you'll notice that so this is the same data call, but depending on the user's preference, right? So if you notice at the top part, the user said, no, I don't want to opt in. Therefore, the data, the JSON data that we give back to the application actually doesn't include the email address, right? But if we say, yes, the user is opted to this, then you actually see the email. So again, from an identity provider perspective, when we're providing that data to the requesting application, we are honoring the user's consent, but that's not to say that, the service provider might not have saved email from a previous session, right? So that's the whole concept between, who really enforces it. We can design systems so that we provide the data of how the user, has preferred their data to be shared, but ultimately, it could also not be guaranteed. Here's some examples of a design for opt-out UIs. Just to give you guys kind of more concrete examples. So on the upper right-hand side, I guess left from your guys' perspective, users can say, hey, I want to remove my consent. And then from the other perspective, we have a similar UI where we say, okay, for this client, do you want to revoke, sharing if there were scopes there, sharing the information with the specific client. So kind of coming back to that opt-in comment that I was making, so there's definitely a lot of requests from our customers to enforce opt-out, but really opt-in is just as important. Some clients, kind of view this as like, well, if I have different tiers of opting in, that allows me to have, more effective campaign targeting. I know that, this user is more engaged than another user. And for them, that could, potentially translate into, more engagement and, having those, paying attention to those users because that, they're actually, more qualified leads or engagement than, some of the other customers that may not want to opt into as many things. The other thing to consider in this from a design pattern perspective is that making sure that users actually understand what they're opting into. So from a consent management perspective, UI is really important, right? You want to make sure that whatever you are providing your users, that it's something that isn't, cumbersome, that it isn't, something that's overwhelming for them, that you sort of try and simplify it as much as you can, so that they understand, what it is that they're opting into, and this is key to, a successful, consent management system. Another design pattern that we found is that, you want to model your consent data close to your customer data. If you think about, for example, a healthcare example, right? We need to know if Jane's consented for this application to share her data. Maybe it's a life-threatening situation, right? So, you really have to model your consent data close to your customer data. The other assumption and that we found in kind of designing consent is that, we return the result of the consent as a JSON object, but can we make that assumption that, all applications can consume the JSON object? Well, what do you do for legacy applications, right? I kind of liken this to the whole idea of authentication in the sense that you can ask authentication system if I give you a username and password, you just tell me yes or no, did I pass that, right? Or do I give you, similar to a SAML assertion, do I give you more data and do I add more attributes to that response rather than just saying, yes, this user is authenticated? You also want to try to take into consideration, the principle of least privilege. So what, minimum amount of metadata is needed for the application to make decisions. And again, it'd be nice for there to be ability to export the consent data if needed be for applications to consume. From an architectural perspective, you'll notice that the way we've modeled this in the field is that we have the user data and the consent data, so that's sort of our data layer. And then there has to be a governance layer on top of that that enforces that consent that we talked about. And then the interaction between the applications, is, again, through the use of a JSON object. But again, there's a consideration of, well, do the applications just need a yes or a no, or do they actually need more metadata? The other interesting thing is from a complexity perspective, the number of parties that are involved in your consent management actually dictates how complex your system's going to be. I'm just going to skip to the 4-party consent. So this is the scenario, let's say that, my husband passed away and I, his wife, need to be able to access his 401k, but I'm using Google as my identity provider, which is logging into, let's say, Wells Fargo, and Wells Fargo is contracting that out to John Edwards, right? So there's 4 parties that are involved in order for me as the wife to get to the John Edwards, 401k. And what's interesting about this, and I don't know that this is something that we've considered as identity management professionals, is how, from a proofing perspective, what do we do about proving people's relationships, right? How do I know that, what do we do as part of this process to prove that, I'm really the wife, or somebody's my attorney, or somebody is my, my legal agent, or somebody's my legal guardian? How do we model that from a practical perspective? So there's definitely an interesting question there. And consents, I'll just skip to a couple slides here. So you'll notice here's an example schema that we came up with for consent delegation. So at the top part, we're adding a flag on the consent object itself that says, hey, are we allowing this consent to be delegated, yes or no? Presuming, I'm sort of making the assumption that the delegated user is residing within the same identity provider, but here we're adding the ID for the actual delegated user. But obviously, it can be really complex quickly depending on the number of parties that you have in your consent management system. This diagram, I am also very fond of this because this kind of shows that the more fine-grained your consents are, that dictates how easy your user interface is going to be from a design perspective. But at the same time, that you're providing better privacy controls, providing the fine-grained consents. So it's finding that sort of nice balance in the middle where, the user interface is pretty easy to understand, but you're still providing enough privacy controls for your users. Yes, and just making sure from a logging perspective that you, there's a question of when you revoke consents, do you remove that row, or do you actually just add a new entry that says, hey, we just revoked this but not actually delete it from your data? And last slide, design pattern takeaways. Consent is its own object type. Separate your consent metadata objects from your consent records. Provide a easy to understand UI for users to manage consent. Enforce your opt-in, opt-outs. Typically there's a governance layer as part of that. Implement your consent data close to your user data. And again, the more parties that you have in your consent, the more complex it gets. And just making sure that you're aware of your auditing requirements. And with that, I am going to open the floor for any questions.
So why don't you get you started and other people
Yes.
Hold on, I need to run the mic.
Oh, yes.
Who's first?
So you mentioned XACML in one of the slides. Do you also model your consent requirements as policies?
Yeah.
And okay, and how do you? What's the communication between the PDP? I'm assuming the PDP decides, okay, is consent required or not. Do you have like a consent decision on top of the authorization decision that you're returning?
So the way we've implemented it for ours is it's actually all part of one suite. So we have one product that hosts the underlying data, and then we have a governance layer on top of that that basically just communicates to it honesty over LDAP. But what it does is when it pulls the user information, we write the XACML policies on that governance layer, and so we can specify, and then it has a connection out to like a no auth, authorization server for the access tokens. And then when a request comes in, we can map that to a XACML policy on our governance layer side that says, if client ID is this, then this is the type of data that should be excluded. So the governance layer and the data layer are actually very tightly coupled.
Okay, so there is no separation of a decision engine and an enforcer. They're basically the same thing for consent. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
I actually think we have to stop now. I'm sorry, you guys. I know there's probably more questions, but
Sorry.
we want to make sure
guys.
Philip has his. Thanks, Remy.
Thank you.